I will open a public hearing on item A under visitors, second public hearing, California Voter Rights Act, criteria for drafting maps, presentation by legal counsel and demographer. We'll open up that hearing at 8:03 p.m. And I believe I'll read this, which was written by an attorney. Good evening, everyone! Exclamation point. Welcome to the Acton-Agua Dulce Unified School District second public hearing on the criteria used for drafting trustee area maps under California Voting Rights Act, or CVRA, as it is commonly known. The purpose of today's public hearing is to receive input from the public on criteria to be used for the maps of the 5 trustee areas that will be drawn by the demographer. Although the criteria are specified in state law to some degree, the public's input on criteria will be very helpful. After tonight's hearing, there will be a public hearing on November 14th to discuss the maps drafted by our demographer. Before I turn over the podium to our legal counsel, Ron Wenkart, to introduce our demographer, Justin Levitt, I am going to just mention a few major points. The CVRA is a state law which prohibits at-large voting systems that impair the ability of racial or ethnic communities to elect the candidate of their choice. The CVRA favors district-based election systems in which candidates must reside in a trustee area, and only the voters residing in that trustee area vote for these candidates. To avoid the potential for litigation and the cost of attorney's fees, the board has decided to modify the current election system and establish a district-based system for the 2026 election. That means that beginning in 2026, voters in those trustee areas up for election in 2026 will vote for one candidate in their trustee area, and the remaining trustees will hold an election in 2028. The change in the election system will not affect the 2024 election or school attendance boundaries. I am now going to turn over the podium to our legal counsel to introduce our demographer and provide us with additional information, followed by public input. Before you go on, Ron, I want everyone to know that every piece of paper, including the initial demand that was sent to us by an attorney, is included on every agenda packet every time anything about this is discussed. Can you pull up that screen quick and show everybody all the attachments that were on this agenda? We're killing a lot of trees, but every part of it is there. So any meeting, anybody watches about this, you will be able to see the entire information packet. As additional information becomes available, we will add it to that list. Ron?
Well, thank you very much, Board President Hallsgraf. Appreciate you your introduction of this matter. It's my honor to introduce Justin Levitt, who's Vice President of the National Demographics Corporation, also known as NDC. Justin has been with NDC for 20 years, and he has worked with numerous school districts, community college districts, special districts, and cities, including in this area, West Side and Lancaster school districts. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Levitt to do a PowerPoint presentation on this California Voting Rights Act.
All right, good evening. I just want to check in, make sure everybody can hear me, and ask if we can pull up the presentation, or I can share my screen, whichever is easier.
We could hear you.
Okay.
We could go ahead, Dr. Levitt. We'll pull up the presentation for you.
Thank you. Just as we're pulling it up, I won't just say that, we went through this presentation a couple of weeks ago. My goal here is not to repeat all of the information that we said last time, but to make sure we kind of review and go through all the necessary legal requirements at this stage of the process. Tonight, I know on the agenda following this presentation you'll have an opportunity to approve the list of criteria we're using in the districting process. And that's something that we've increasingly looked at as an important step, just to make sure that for our legal requirements, we've done all of our checks and balances. So the presentation is pulled up, ready to go. I'm sorry, on the shared screen, I can see the agenda, but not the presentation.
We're working on it, Dr. Levitt.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you see it now, Dr. Levitt?
Right now it has a black screen on my computer.
There we go. It's on my screen. I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Mr. Winkart.
So if we go to the election system slide 2, essentially what the superintendent, or sorry, what the president has already laid out essentially summarizes what we're looking at doing here. Essentially transitioning the method of election from an at-large system where all residents of the district are able to elect all members to the board on a rotating basis, to elect 2 seats up in 1 year, 3 seats up in the following year, to a by-district or by-trustee area system, where the district is divided into 5 equally populated areas, and only the residents within each area get to vote for that trustee once every 4 years. As already mentioned, this is because of the California Voting Rights Act. And if we go to the next slide, just a little bit of the California Voting Rights Act. This is a law that was specifically written to encourage this by trustee area elections. It makes the legal requirements significantly weaker than the Federal Voting Rights Act, which traditionally has been very difficult to use against local jurisdictions, just on the basis that they use an at-large election system. And because of this, liability is only determined by whether or not members of different racial or ethnic groups vote differently, and whether or not that constitutes vote dilution. And the law is written to favor the plaintiffs. If the city wins or if the school district wins, then they don't get to recoup any of their costs. On the other hand, if the plaintiff goes to court and wins, they can recoup for 6 or 7 figures minimum. As we can see on the next slide, the impact of this has been immense. Some of those legal settlements have ranged in the 6 or 7 figures. For example, the city of Palmdale settled for $4.7 million. Modesto back in 2008, so over a decade and a half ago, settled for $3 million, and so on. In addition, there have been several court cases. Every court case so far has gone in favor of the California Voting Rights Act. One case, Santa Monica case, has gone to the Supreme Court, and even that was not on the legality of the law itself, but more on the question of what standard was used to determine liability. And so as a result, you've seen this transition across the state. At this point, over 250 school districts and over 200 cities have either made the change to district or trustee area elections or are in the process of doing so. And the state, if we go to the next slide, lays out this timeline to do it. We've had 2 initial hearings to talk about the criteria and rules governing the districting process. In addition, last week we also held a community forum online. Following this hearing, we get to start drawing the maps. The first round of draft maps have to be released by November 7th. And on November 14th will be our first chance to have a public hearing at a board meeting on those maps. Following that, we'll have a community forum on November 20th and a second hearing in front of the board on December 19th to look at final versions of those maps or potentially revisions or updates. And the final map is scheduled to be adopted by the board on December 16th. Following that, or December 19th, sorry. Following that, the map goes into the County Committee on School District Organization, which has to hold a hearing within your district, and that'll be in early 2025. Now, turning to those rules and goals for drawing trustee areas, we divide them into 3 categories based on where they come from. That first column, federal laws, are things that apply to every jurisdiction in the country, all the way from drawing congressional districts down to our local schools and special districts. And first and foremost is equal population. This is the one person, one vote principle. Trustee areas have to have about the same number of total residents as counted in the last census. And we'll take that total census population number, divide by 5 to get our target population. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at the actual numbers on the following slides. In addition, we have to respect the requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act. While race and ethnicity cannot be the only factor or the predominant factor in drawing a trustee area, we do have to watch for protected class communities and make sure that our district lines don't negatively harm groups. We've actually have done an analysis as required by law of the district, and we did not see any areas that really get up to that federal voting rights standard. That doesn't mean that there aren't communities or other neighborhoods that we need to take into account later on. And that really brings us into that second column. California passed a new law last year, the Fair Maps Act, that lays out a list of rank ordered criteria that we'll be adopting later tonight that lay out in a priority ranking for what we need to follow when we're drawing trustee area lines. First is geographical contiguity. This is the principle that districts have to be contiguous or touch, all parts have to touch. You can't have a little bit up in the northeast corner of the district in Agua Dulce, and then a little bit in central Acton that don't actually have a physical connection or link to each other. Generally speaking, the principle the courts uses, is it possible to walk or drive from one part of a trustee area to all other parts of that trustee area without leaving the trustee area? Second is avoiding division of neighborhoods and communities of interest. We're going to go into this more on a couple slides later, but I want us to start thinking about neighborhoods and communities of interest as the law defines them, socioeconomic or geographic areas that need to be kept together for the purpose of their fair and effective representation. Third is avoiding division of cities and census designated places. We have 2 census designated places within our district here, Acton and Agua Dulce. And so to the extent that we can draw districts that avoid extraneous or extra divisions of those areas, we have to look at doing that. And then fourth, easily identifiable boundaries. This is the principle that it should be easy for voters to understand which trustee area they live in. And so to the extent we can follow major roads or other natural or man-made boundaries, rather than jogging through little back roads or neighborhoods, we should strive to do that. And then lastly, the 5th priority is compactness, specifically defined here as not bypassing one group of people to get to a more distant group of people. That's aimed at hooks and fingers, odd lines that look like they're specifically designed to get a particular house or neighborhood. Now, these are rank ordered for a reason. So if, for example, we're following a canyon and we want to put all the homes along a particular canyon into a district as a neighborhood or as a community, we need to do that first, even if it looks less than perfectly compact. And then finally, in the top of the 3rd column, the law also contains a prohibition on drawing or adopting election district boundaries for the purpose of discriminating or favoring against an incumbent political candidate or political party. And so these lines will be drawn blind to where the current board resides. In addition, there'll be no political information or information about the partisan registration or makeup of the trustee areas on the maps. Third, other traditional districting principles. This is our column, or this is our section where we talk about other factors like attendance areas or maintaining certain overlap with other jurisdictions as a potential traditional principle that we can look at including after and only after we look at all of our federal and state requirements. So that's kind of a catch-all for things like future population growth, like attendance areas, and all sorts of other things we think are important to consider which we can consider, just not prioritize over the requirements. So looking at our overall demographics, the census counted 12,265 residents in the district last year. This is again our total population. Of that population, 64% non-Hispanic white, 28% or Hispanic or Latino, and then smaller percentages for different racial or ethnic groups. Those numbers are fairly similar, 70% to 24% for our citizen voting age population. That's the population over the age of 18 with US citizenship. The citizen voting age population is what we use when we look at the Voting Rights Act, because that's what the courts call the eligible voter count, who is eligible to register and to vote. If we go to the next slide, dividing that 12,265 number by 5, each of the 5 trustee areas will have about 2,453 residents. Now, I don't expect any of the trustee areas will have exactly 2,453 residents because the courts do allow us some deviation or difference from perfect equality to keep all of those other goals and requirements active. In other words, we shouldn't create an uglier district just because it's not perfectly at 2,453. At most, we're allowed a 10% difference between the largest or smallest, which means that each of the districts might be about 125 people larger to about 125 people smaller than that target number. Overall, about a 250 person difference between the largest and the smallest. In addition to that, we have a lot of other demographic information on this slide. A lot of this is useful for helping to identify communities of interest or where we see differences. For example, looking at housing or income, looking at where we see people of different age groups or different languages spoken at home, where we see families with children, for example. And we'll provide all this information broken up by trustee area when we draw the maps. Moving to the next slide, we did do a demographic analysis as part of our report, looking at the Latino citizen voting age population. The areas that are in the blues and purples have small Latino populations, under 25% for purple, under 35% for blue. The areas that are in yellow and pink have larger Latino populations, over 75% for pink, over 65% for blue. But what we run into, of course, is that the size of the census blocks, those are the smallest unit of census geography, do not actually reflect always the number of people who reside within that area. Some of those big pink and yellow blocks, particularly just south of, the highway there, Highway 14 there, we have a very large yellow block. I think there's about 20 residents who live in that block. It's just a massive area that's mostly open space. And meanwhile, some of those small pink blocks look smaller, but they actually have much larger numbers of residents. And so all of what I want to say without the map is that, it's important to take this with a understanding that the size of the census blocks don't always reflect the number of people within them. Overall, we don't see any concentrations of Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans, or Native Americans. If we go to the next slide, this really brings us then to the heart of the districting process. I like to think of these neighborhoods as the building blocks, the smallest building blocks that we use as basis for drawing our trustee areas. Essentially, a neighborhood is an area defined by a historical and geographic boundary. This is something that we can point to the areas along a particular street or in a particular subdivision or in a particular planned community. Sometimes as small as a specific apartment building or condominium complex. Sometimes a little bit larger because it's a set of homes, or like a few blocks of homes designed by a single developer in a specific year. Sometimes it's defined by their neighbors, the areas that touch a specific park, the areas along a specific road. But really what we're getting at with neighborhoods is specifically about the geography. We should be able to point to some geographic feature that helps us define where that neighborhood is. That's why I like to call them the small little Lego blocks that begin the process of building up into our larger districts. If we go to the next slide, communities of interest then are the way that these neighborhoods fit together. Communities of interest are populations that share a common or social economic interest that should be included within a single district or trustee area for the purpose of their fair and effective representation. And so what this means is that this is how the Legos build together into those shapes that are our trustee areas. The shared policy concerns like attendance areas or public safety issues. One time in a school district, it was about a specific bus route. Another time it had to do with crossings on a particular street. But it doesn't have to be simply public policy concerns, shared history, shared socioeconomic concerns, shared voter registration rates. I like to use examples like, we had some areas that are defined by horse owning communities and where the deed specifically required that the properties maintain facilities for horses as one of our communities of interest in a rural district. Other times it's the farming community or other specific things that are bringing neighborhoods together under a common issue or a common concern. Just as a reminder, this means that what we're looking at are these policy, social, economic concerns, not looking at partisanship or relationship to a particular candidate or party as the reason for that community. If we go to the next slide, just to give you a couple of maps showing some differences across the district. These are kind of at the block group level, so units of about 2,000 residents. Not necessarily precise detail, but kind of some general trends. We have how percent of households earning more than 75,000 on the left, percent of families with a child at home on the right. And this is, these are examples of things that often come up as issues that define communities of interest or create communities of interest. But they're no substitute for your local knowledge and awareness of the district. And if something doesn't work or something's not right to look at for our district here, then we ignore it and we focus on those issues that are important that we hear from the community. And then if we go to the last slide, really what we're looking at here is for you to help us with our starting points. We're going to come back with a minimum of 3 maps at our next hearing. And so what factors should we consider? What neighborhoods, what communities of interest, what geographic boundaries should we be looking at as we're starting to put pen to paper and draw the lines on the map? I'm also happy to address any other questions about the process or criteria. I know we have a criteria adoption following this presentation. And so any questions you have about that or the timeline, I'm happy to address as well. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. First, I'll ask if there's any public comment on this or public input on this item. Anyone in the room? Anyone online? We'll turn to the board. Do you have any comments? There are no comments from the board. Therefore, I believe it's time to close the public hearing at 8:27.